Okay, stream seems to be working. Hi there. Let me just turn the resolution of my preview down, 'cause it doesn't eat my bandwidth. Hi Herminator. Excellent. You may hear some kittens in the background occasionally whining. I've had to throw them out of the room because they make a lot of noise. Archie's in the room though, sleeping at the moment. Hi Karine. Let's give people a minute or two to see who's joining. Anybody got any questions while we're just getting up and running? I haven't really got an agenda to talk about today. Just going to have a play with what I'm currently working on while we're chatting. I didn't give a lot of notice. I don't know how many people. Well, not so far away then, Karine. Bonjour. Let's see what we've got here. I've got a lot of particles on the screen at the moment, so I'm just going to turn those off. Thank you. Okay, that should make it a little bit more responsive. Just 5 of us at the moment, or 6 including me. It's been rather a busy week for me. Anybody got any thoughts on my next tutorials? I've been thinking I might go over some of the older subjects that I've done, perhaps not smoke or volumetrics for a while, but maybe go through a lot of the modifiers. I've certainly done that before, but maybe I can cover them in a bit more detail now, and I'm sure some of them have changed slightly, or the way they work has changed slightly since I first did them. Just checking my node setup here. Is the video okay? Should be 1080p hopefully. I did consider just having some sort of video playing while we were chatting, but you never know how many people are going to turn up. Sometimes it's quite a lot and it's difficult to keep track of all the conversations, and sometimes it's just a few. So I don't do too many live streams. Let's see. We do have a translucent in there. That's fine then. So what I was going to do is put an image in there actually. Oh, that's the wrong thing. Lattice modifier, yeah. I've had a bit of a play with that in the last few months. One of the things I have been playing with quite a bit recently actually, and I'm thinking of making some sort of connection with Blender, is I bought an Oculus Go. I don't know whether you've heard of that. So it's sort of similar to the Oculus Rift, but it's not as powerful, although it does have a slightly higher resolution screen. And it's not tethered, so you can move around with it. It's basically like a Gear VR and that sort of thing. You don't have to put your mobile phone in it. It's already got a display in there, but it's quite a good display. Yeah, I know what that's like, Herminator. And so what it's very good at, as well as playing games and things like that, is showing 360 videos and 360 VR experiences, so actual 3D. And I know Blender's capable of producing those sort of things, particularly the side-by-side type 3D videos. So I was thinking of either, well, perhaps initially a still image, and then I'll do a tutorial on how to create that and how to import that into some format that will be usable by the Oculus Go or similar devices, and then perhaps do a video as well. I've watched a few old side-by-side 3D videos on YouTube with the Oculus Go, and they were very, very good, even though some of them were quite a few years old. They may even have been made in Blender, possibly. I think it'll make Blender work quite hard in terms of the rendering if I do it at a reasonable resolution, but I think it'll be interesting to do. And there may be some people interested in that. I think these sort of devices are getting more common now, so it's perhaps time we started to, or I started to have a look at that. And I will do a little review of the Oculus Go as well. I think I paid about just over £200 for mine, so that's probably $250, although it's probably slightly cheaper in the US. But mine was the 64GB one. You can get one with slightly less memory, 32 gigs I think, and that's quite a bit cheaper. So I'm planning to do a review on that once I feel I've got it all, I understand it all, as it were, and particularly when I feel there's some sort of connection I can make with Blender. And I've also been playing a little bit with Meshroom, which is the free tool to basically do photogrammetry. So I took some old photogrammetry photographs I'd done some time ago, and hi Fodcom, I assume you're the person that's been chatting to me on Twitter. Yeah, I will sort you out with those, don't worry. I'll send you a tweet or an email with where to find those files. Where was I? So yes, I'm going to be doing a little bit about photogrammetry as well, and obviously integrating that with Blender. It took me a little while the first time I did it, but now that I've got the hang of it, I think it's pretty straightforward with just using the defaults. But what I also want to do is, it uses a, in fact I can probably fire it up here. Don't worry about all the hundreds of icons, I know you're all studying those now. But it uses a similar sort of node system to Blender, so I'm guessing it's written in Python. So here it is, this is Meshroom, so you can see these nodes down here, and this is how you control the analysis of the images that you put into it, and obviously set the different options, and you select one and you've got various options you can pick from here. So once I've got a better understanding of how this all works, I'll do a tutorial about that, and particularly about how you then use that in Blender. I think that'll be quite interesting. I'm particularly keen on whether there's some ways that I can use Meshroom to do some photogrammetry on small objects. So I'm looking at whether I can use a fixed position for the camera and then put it on a Lazy Susan, a rotating bed. I did try that and it didn't work very well the first time. It didn't really work at all, but I think it may be because I didn't put something that was visible to Meshroom, that was visibly rotating, as it were, so it got confused about exactly what it should be sampling, I think. So I've got a bit of work to do on that as well. So I've got quite a few projects on the go that are sort of, they're Blender but they're also outside of Blender, and I think they'll be quite interesting. I haven't tried 2.8 yet, Baz. I'm always in a quandary about new versions. I've certainly been watching the reviews and tutorials on it just to start to get a heads up on what's happening, but of course it's still very much in flux, so it depends on what ends up in the build and what doesn't. And I'm always very reluctant to sort of upgrade to the latest version and start creating tutorials for it when it's not really available to everybody yet, and could change, because it could be I demonstrate some feature that perhaps is removed in the final version, and then that's not going to be very useful to people. Right, what was I doing? I was just going to go and check if I did have a translucent, but maybe it's not translucent enough. Oops, need a little bit. If it starts jittering, just tell me, because obviously I'm using the same computer to stream as I am, in this case, to render, and that can make it struggle a little bit sometimes. This particular scene is quite heavy, even when all of the particles are switched off. I'm just having a look at the translucence on these leaves up here. Well, I'm going to replace the texture on them in a minute. They're not very translucent. Ah, that'll be why. All very quiet today. So what have you all been up to with your Blend projects? And what sort of things do you like doing on Blender? I tend to like to do a lot of animation, although I feel I've done a lot of a particular amount of animation recently, which means I haven't spent as much time sort of working on creating nice images, nice scenes, and so I thought it was time I got back to some nature scenes, because they're some of my that's really what I started with, I guess, after a bit of playing around with particles and abstract stuff. And I've got some sort of ideas bubbling away about some abstract scenes as well. I'd like to get control the motion of some smoke using particles as well. So we'll see how that goes. So I think I'm just going to. Thank you, Dorja. They certainly take quite a bit of time to make. They don't actually take that long to record. They take maybe an hour to record most tutorials, but then they take me 3 or 4 or more hours to edit them and cut out the bits that aren't adding to the tutorial and so on, and correct mistakes and things like that. So there is quite a bit of time that I put into creating them, so I'm pleased you like them. Let's see if I can narrow that down a bit. There we go, that's a bit less heavy. So as I was saying, what sort of thing do you like to do in Blender? Modeling, yeah. Yeah, I do keep coming back to VFX myself, specifically things like putting Blender objects into typically live action. I think it's one thing to just take a 3D model and put that in a still scene, and you see that quite a lot. And with the tools in Blender, it can be very, very convincing with very little post-processing. But you can really make it extra convincing if it's put into a short video where you've got a little bit of camera wobble and you've tracked it and so on. I've done a little bit of that. Have you had trouble, Kim, with the light not getting through all the layers of glass? So where they start to look opaque. That's typically. Oh, the kittens have worked out how. Or almost worked out how to open the door. They're pulling the handle now, so you may hear that. Unfortunately, they are getting very good at opening doors. Yeah, they haven't managed to open this one yet. They hang on the handles until the door opens. Anyway, yeah, I do that sort of thing as well, Herminator. Because I'm so familiar with Blender, I don't use what you might call proper CAD tools to model things for 3D printing. I actually use Blender. Oh, they almost made it that time. Sorry for the noise. those kittens. Sorry if I'm quiet occasionally. I'm reading the comments. I've got them on slow because otherwise they tend to fly up a little bit too fast. Motion tracking, yeah, you'd be surprised actually. You can, for example, if you want to have a quick stab at motion tracking, I've certainly done a few tutorials and there are many others online about them, and you can usually download a little video file, a free video file, and then just take a cube and do a little bit of tracking on the video file and put your cube on there and see how well it goes. There's some little tricks on there. You certainly want lots of tracking points and things like that, and you want to pick good places to track and so on. But especially if you use some of the files that other people have used to track, it's especially with the latest version of Blender, it's easier than you expect. And particularly with the shadow catcher, one of the tricky things before was getting shadows that looked right for objects that you put into the scene, the sort of soft shadows that you might see. Yes, who was that? Kim. I was just going to show you down here. What you want to look at is that maximum number of transmission bounces. Although it says bounces, what it really means is the light that is passing through objects. So if you're having trouble with transparent objects, and this is also true of things where you're using alpha images, so what I was about to add to here actually. So you add a texture, an image texture, and perhaps you use an alpha texture. I'm sure I'll have one somewhere. Perhaps like this, like a leaf, like this fern leaf, that sort of thing, or a holly leaf. If you use that, and you have lots of them, one in front of the other, the areas around here will require Blender to work out the transparencies, and if you find it sort of going black as it goes backward, then what you can do is increase the transmission bounces here, and you can increase them quite a long way. If it's just going black in terms of things like sunlight or whatever shining onto surfaces below it, then you may need to go to your lamp or your sun and then go to the settings for that and increase the bounces here. Depends on what issue you're having. Yes, you absolutely can use footage from a mobile phone, Herminator. The only thing I would say is that obviously it tends to be fairly heavily compressed from a mobile phone, and you may have some more challenges in terms of tracking. So if you are going to use mobile phone footage, try to use footage that doesn't jump around too much. A little bit of movement is good because it helps convince the viewer that the tracked object is really in the scene because the camera is moving around a little bit. But if the camera is really jumping around very fast, that will give you much more challenges. You'll have to basically do a lot more manual tracking and perhaps a certain amount of guessing as to where the camera is pointing. But yes, you absolutely can use mobile phone footage. I hope that helped you anyway, Kim. Have a look at that is what I suggest. And you've also got this one up here, of course. Transmission and transparency. Increase both of those. Yeah. Well, one of the things you can do is you need to find out for the particular mobile, if you can, for the particular mobile phone, what the lens data is. So if I go to here somewhere and we do motion tracking. It's been a while since I've done this. I don't think I can bring the settings up without loading a video file. But essentially there are things like the focal length that you can put into there and things like that, and you can usually get those by just do some Google searches for the particular mobile phone that was used. enter those, and that will help with the accuracy of the tracking. Well, what you can do, Kim, is do something like what I'm doing, which is Control B over your camera view, and that will then define a smaller area that you want to render, and that will obviously not take so long to render, and you can just do it over the area of the scene that has the information you're trying to look at in. Hi Martin. Just randomly chatting about different subjects. We've had a little bit of a chat about using a mobile phone for doing camera tracking or creating footage for camera tracking, and a little bit of discussion about light bounces for transmissive objects like layers of glass that are one in front of the other. So one of the questions I was asking people is what sort of thing they've been doing with Blender. Hi Jay. Well, I do quite a few procedural materials myself. I mean, most of the materials I've got in this scene are procedural at the moment. I would say, I have got a few tutorials myself, but the main thing to do is to really learn about the nodes. I mean, I don't know whether you've already started to get to grips with the nodes, but that's really how you build up your understanding of materials and how the procedural materials will work. Noise, I mean, I use that under textures, the noise texture, and use it all the time because it just adds that bit of randomness. You can do all sorts of things with it. You can distort it, you can use large scale noises and fine scale ones and combine them and so on. I absolutely use that all the time. Yeah, and things like that. Obviously you need to start to build your understanding of how materials work. I've done several tutorials on that sort of thing, but maybe I need to do one specifically on procedural materials. That's not a bad idea. I don't think I've done one like that. But understanding things like metals and reflective objects. So as a quick tip, for most non-metallic objects, they talk about things like dielectric and stuff like that, but don't worry about those sorts of excessively technical terms in my view. Essentially, if it's not metallic, not a metal, apart from some special effects or special materials that you want to look at, then when you use a glossy, you set it to white or nearly white, just off white here. If on the other hand it is a metal, it'll almost, with the possible exception of something like chrome, it will almost always be slightly coloured, and and pretty much that's how the basic metal colour, metal look is established. And then you add things like noise and stuff like that to give you the different surface finishes. So that's just one worth remembering. The glossy for a metal object should have a colour unless it's chrome. The glossy for anything that's not a metal should typically be white or just off white. Well, if you want to email them to me, Kim, and perhaps a screenshot of your node setup, then I'm happy to have a look at that. You can send it to sardi333@googlemail.com, or just send it to me on Twitter or something like that, or on my Facebook group, Sadi Pax. Is that what I call it? I called it something like that. Anyway, it's linked in my channel. I'm sure there'll be something that's just not quite right, obviously. But either send me a node setup, or you can send me a blend file if you want to, and I'll have a look in. Hi, Jakib. That sounds like a good project. So how are you going about that? You're getting some old maps and then perhaps some old photographs. Hi, Will Machii. Oops. I think a project like that, Jackie, would be good to do in 360 view as well, because certainly whether you're looking at it on a 2D screen and scanning around or using some sort of VR goggles, that would really sort of bring it back to life, wouldn't it? No, I'm sure it isn't. And I guess you'll have to use a certain amount of artistic license to interpret what things might have looked like. Or maybe some things like paintings and drawings, as well as early photographs. Or even descriptions. Sounds like a lot of work, but sounds like quite an interesting project too. And I think that's one of those sorts of projects that if you're successful at it and you're able to really produce something that captures people's imagination, that can make a name for you. Good luck with that, and do send me a link once you've got something, and I'll be very pleased to have a look at it. Sounds very interesting indeed. In fact, I mean, the idea of having perhaps, and I think I've seen some versions of it, of a sort of Google Earth, but for cities and what have you from quite some time in the past, whether it's in the 40s or even earlier than that, like medieval cities. What did they look like? Obviously we've only got a certain amount of information, although I think cities like London, there's probably quite a lot of information. I think that's something that we can do. We can go quite a long way with in CG. Where was I? Oh yes. Yeah, I did, Kim, I did a couple of scenes myself with essentially the moon. I think it's well worth having a look at some of the footage from things like the Apollo missions. And obviously one of the key things is that there really is basically only one light source, unless the astronauts or whatever have torches with them. One light source and then reflected light. There's no fog in the air or anything like that, so, which makes it a little bit sort of artificial, I suppose. And you also want to make the primary light source, the sun, a very small light, which gives you very hard shadows. But make sure it's got plenty of bounces so it can bounce around on surfaces, and then that illuminates at least a little bit of the darker side of rocks and things like that. I did the Moonlander in a lunar scene. It's probably on one of my portfolios somewhere. What's going on there? That's fair enough. Yeah, well, I mean, light is what it's all about, really. I mean, that's what CG is, I suppose. We wouldn't see very much if there wasn't any light in the scene. And I do remember my first experience at Cycles. I turned it on. I think had a bit of a play with Blender Internal, and then I switched over to the Cycles render engine, and it was black. And it took me a few minutes to work out that I hadn't put any lights in the scene, so of course it was black. I think Blender Internal gives you a different default. I think it gives you a sort of grey background, so there's always a little bit of light in the scene. So I hadn't really worked out that I needed a lamp to be able to see anything. That was a few years ago now. Oh, I'm sure it will. I'm a little bit uneasy about 2.8's change in the user interface, because that's gonna slow me down for a little while. I mean, I don't exactly know precisely what the change is going to be like yet, but I believe this is all going to be quite different, and I do use this menu quite a bit. I tend not to use keyboard shortcuts all that much. I use a few, but I don't use an awful lot. I tend to use menus. Maybe I'm more visual. And obviously a lot of those will be completely different. They're still there, but they're just slightly buried, to be honest. But I guess it's got to be moved forward. I guess we've got to keep it modern and fresh to make it interesting to new users. Well, I don't think everything is going to switch to Eevee unless I've missed something on my understanding. A certain amount of Cycles materials will transfer to Eevee. Eevee, as I understand it, will be an additional render engine that you can select. It's effectively it doesn't replace Cycles at all. It is a real-time renderer, and it's, I guess, designed to be a close match to what you would get in a game engine. Hi, Mark. So, and also the principles that you're learning in Cycles are applicable to a large extent to Eevee, but also to other non-Blender applications. So it's not a bad idea to get familiar with how materials work, and particularly the node editor. I think it's a very good way to understand how each of the elements of a material are built up. But yes, I mean, we're all going to have to learn Eevee. I've obviously because I haven't downloaded 2.8, I haven't spent any time trying to get to grips with it, but essentially my understanding is that certain materials will work and certain materials will not in Eevee. So we're going to need Cycles for the time being. I guess if Eevee could do everything that Cycles could do, why would you need Cycles? But it can't at the moment. And I've spent a little bit of time looking fairly closely at some of the animations and stills, and Eevee's great, and it's going to be particularly good for doing quick renders of things like, in my mind I've got an idea of a walk through a gallery, so you've got still images on the wall and you're walking around looking at them. I did one like that before, and it was quite some time ago, and hopefully my skills have developed a bit since then, and my computer's improved a bit since then. But even so, it took a long time to render, even at a not entirely satisfactory a standard. Hopefully with Eevee that will be a bit different. Yeah, I agree, Mark, but I also think at the moment that the target currently for Eevee is not to replace Cycles. It is to offer a way to visualize what something would look like in a real-time render game engine, a modern one. So it's very good, and also I guess a way to create very quick rendered animations. Yeah, and I think volumetrics have their challenges as well, but we'll see how it all works. Obviously, it might be that for those of us that do animation, Eevee's the way to go. And then probably we won't do so much cycles. We'll really have to see how it goes. But like I said, if Eevee ends up doing everything that cycles can do, why would you need another render engine? But I think there's a lot of commonality. There's a lot of commonality or links between the way Eevee works and cycles works, even if they're not completely transferable. Actually, these days I mostly do animations. When I started, it was mostly stills. But as my skills have improved, as Blender's improved, as my computer's improved a little bit, I can just about do... Good night, Herminator. I can just about do what I consider to be reasonable quality renders with multiple frames, you know, hundreds or thousands of frames, so animations. So I do enjoy animations a lot, but I also like to go back to the still scenes such as this one every so often, because I think you can spend a lot more time on a given scene. You're not making so many compromises in order to be able to render it in a reasonable time. So a still image, it can spend all night rendering if need be, although that would still be a long time for a still image. Whereas an animation, you would want to have rendered quite a few frames overnight if you leave it running. So one frame, you know, I think the longest sort of animations that I've done, an individual frame might take a minute or so to render, and that's quite a long time for my own computer to be rendering. Well, I do occasionally use the principled shader. I mean, I'm in two minds about it. They use different terminology. Oh, I'm just creating a sort of lakeside scene. Whether it turns into a tutorial or whether I even finish it remains to be seen. And right now I'm just sort of playing around, putting an alpha texture on these leaves just to make them a little better because they're closer to the camera. And I was just having a look to see if I had an alpha channel on this image texture. I had a play with Blender Game Engine quite a long time ago, but it is obviously another different set of skills. Thank you. And I like the idea of it, the way it works as blocks, but unfortunately I don't think it's completely there. I mean, what I've always felt is that you ought to be able to, if you built a game in Blender Game Engine, you ought to be able to just hit a button and it creates a compiled file which you can just give to someone and say, there, go and try my game. They've never quite done that. Although that said, I believe there is some interoperability between Blender Game Engine and Unity and things like that. So some of the skills you're going to learn in the Blender Game Engine presumably are transferable to Unity. And one day, when I have the time, I may actually start to look at something like Unity, because I know that's very popular and there's quite a bit of demand for that. I'm aware of render farms and things like that. I don't make a huge amount of money doing this, so I'd have to look at how I know with Sheepit it's more about sharing what you're doing, and I do that, but also I like to really control what's going on. So at the moment I'll try to make animations that I can do myself. I've actually got a couple of computers, one's quite a bit older, and if it's a really heavy animation, like I did the little dancing tree animation a year ago or however long ago it was, Guardians of the Galaxy character, and that took quite a long time to render, and I think I shared some of the rendering between a couple of computers because it did take such a long time. Yeah, it is free, Kim, I believe, but I think to keep it free you have to sort of share all your assets and things, and it's not that I want to hold onto everything, but I like to control what I'm doing and then decide, do I want to share this? And also in some cases, of course, I'm using licensed images, so I've got accounts with CG Textures and things like that. Just reading, just keeping up to date with the comments. Let's just stop that a minute. How are we doing for time? So I was going to do a chat just for about an hour and see how things go. So, Martin, what sort of thing do you make in Blender? What sort of projects do you use it for? That's somewhat true, Mark. Obviously the more complex you're seeing, the more geometry, and you're seeing the more work Blender has to do. But you can control that to some extent. So if you can create some of the geometry with at render time by using normal effects, then that can minimize it a bit. Yeah, well, we're all learning. What sort of drew you to Blender? Oh yeah, I presume that's a Mac. That Blackmagic Design eGPU is presumably a Mac graphics card, I assume. Oh yes. How did you get on with that, Martin? Does have an upper background. Water can be tricky. I think that's one of the main areas I'd like to see improvement in Blender, and there's been a lot of talk about MantaFlow and things like that, and that'd be quite exciting if we can get that into Blender at some point. Depends what you're trying to do with water. I mean, I've got some water in this scene. Using layer weight is an important addition for water. Using noise is important. Understanding that at certain angles the surface of water is actually opaque, or rather completely reflective. You can't see through it. That's why we wear Polaroid lenses, to see through the surface of reflective things like water. If you want flowing water, that starts to get more tricky. But certainly using layer weight, I mean, I've got a water texture on here I can show you actually. Why don't I just do that? So this is a very simple water shader that I've got. Oh, that's not the one. Here it is, once it comes up. Okay, very simple water shader here. So I've got a noise texture here going into a bump node, that's going into a layer weight and a glossy, and I've got a transparent down here with sort of slightly greenish, fairly dark colour on it. That's going into a mix shader. The gloss is going into one side, the gloss is basically white, transparent into the other. The layer weight determines the depending on the angle of the light bouncing back into the camera, determines whether the light goes through the water, bounces off the surface below, or whether it just bounces off the surface of the water, in which case it's a brighter, whiter reflection. And then using this bump, I've added a surface noise, basically. I can show you roughly what that's looking like. So you can see there's some subtle noise in the surface. I UV unwrap this, what is basically a plane as well. And although you can't really see it there, at certain angles you can actually see through. If I look at this scene from a different angle, I've got a load of particles turned off now. So what you're actually seeing there is the ground underneath, but coloured by the transparent. You may just be able to make out that there's something underneath there. But by the time we come around to here, the light's bouncing off at such an angle that most of it is just reflecting. But some of it doesn't and gets slightly coloured, and that gives you that slightly more realistic look for water. I'm not aware of any at the moment. I suspect they'll come along because there's a demand, but on the other hand, do you need them? I mean, yes, I know Substance Painter is obviously a very good thing, particularly for people who want to develop procedural textures, but on the other hand, you can do that in Blender. Once you get familiar with how the nodes work, you can do quite a lot with procedural textures. You'd be surprised at what you can do. I've created textures for vegetables and fruit that were completely procedural. That is my preferred way to go, is procedural textures if I can, or a combination of procedural textures and images. You'd like the earth in your render. Sorry, I took a moment to click back into what you were doing. For the earth, are you creating a sphere and trying to wrap an image around a sphere? If so, do you need to? And what I mean by that is if it's an animation and you're going to animate the earth or move around the earth, then fine, you need to wrap an image around a whole earth, which means you need a very big image in order for it to not show its resolution. On the other hand, even if you use a sphere, and I'd suggest you do use a sphere, if your camera is just looking from one fixed angle, particularly if it's a still scene, then just UV unwrap the sphere to view. So if I just said you project from view, and then you'll find your flat. If you've got a flat image, a 2D image of the earth, you can then just put that straight onto that sphere, and even though it's being distorted, if you look from any other angle, the angle from the camera will look completely flat. It will not flat, it will look completely right, because obviously where it's stretched you're looking at that side on, and it will sort of correct itself, but you'll still get good shading when you're moving your sun around. I don't know if that made sense, Kim. It means that you don't have to have such a high resolution image. It still needs to be a good resolution, but not as high as if you're going to wrap it all the way around the sphere, and after all, if you're not going around the sphere, then that's lots of image that you're never going to see. Yeah, well, again, like I said, is it still something that you're going to need to see the back of, or is it just one part of it? If you're going to need to see the back of it, then you're going to need to either do it procedurally and just make it Earth-ish, or perhaps a combination of procedural and image. So you can use an image to give you the basic, I guess you'd call it the geometry of the Earth, really, the bump on the Earth and things like that, but then use procedural textures to sort of blur some of the edges of that and things like that. Add noise. most people aren't going to know if you've changed some of the high spots and low spots on the Earth, as long as you're not changing something easily recognizable. You're using an HDRI for your stars. So have you seen the in quite a few of my videos I show a quick and dirty way to make, granted not perfect, but to make stars or galaxies or whatever you want with just noise. I can do that here. Have you seen that method, Kim? Force for stars, I mean. Oh right, okay, I don't need to show you then. Absolutely. I mean, it just means you don't have to worry about joins and stitch marks and stuff like that. But certainly using an HDRI and a photo and things for space. I mean, obviously you may be using that because you want to make it accurate and stuff like that. In which case, there's only so much you can get away with. But for the stars and things, I would have thought you'd be better off just making those procedurally in some fashion, whether it's the method I showed or some other method. Just catching up with the comments. Okay, what was I doing? Oh, I was showing you about the water, wasn't I? Blender's struggling a bit with all the stuff it's doing at the moment. Right, let's stop that. Yes, and you can, Kim, and obviously you could do things like blurring the edges or softening the edges by making it grade to transparent right around the edges, and that will sort of make it look like there's an atmosphere around it. Hi Marcelo. Nice to see you again. Where were we? There and that one. Okay. Let's go for some of the leaves. Yeah. Going into hard surface modelling, Mark. I've played around with that. I've done I did a car. I did a Tesla car. I think it was this year, or it was late last year. After they sent that car into space, I'm not sure where it is now. So I thought I'd make a sort of slightly humorous version of it with the spaceman waving, as it were. And I thought that worked quite well, but hard surface modelling is quite challenging sometimes, especially when you've got to have large curved areas that look right, and there's always bodges, especially when you're trying to do it quite quickly, which I always am. But yes, I need to get back into that. I need to watch. I've got a load of videos lined up to watch to hone my skills on that sort of thing. Well, if it lands on either of or crashes on either of those, that'll still be quite impressive. Well, I know obviously as soon as 2.8 is actually released, then that'll be what I'm using, but I don't think it's a good idea, especially if you're learning Blender, to use an experimental version, because first of all things can change because it's experimental, and secondly it's not that stable. And one thing I don't like doing is using software that keeps crashing. And I must say, although in the early days, so the sort of 2.5 days, Blender did have a habit of crashing quite a lot, I find it a lot more stable these days. Although some of that may be because I'm aware of of the limitations of the software and try not to push them too much. I've been sort of half expecting it to crash with this scene. I mean, you can see the memory usage is starting to get a bit high. Okay, Mark. I forget how many gigabytes I've got in my graphics card, but once you start to get much above 1.5 gigs, it tends to get a bit unstable. Kittens are trying to get in again, which is why you can hear the door being tried. I haven't quite got enough strength to open this door yet. Yeah, one of these days I'll have a Linux PC, or a Linux machine anyway. Hi Trabuco. Yeah, it is very different, and I guess to some extent I'm almost putting it off, but once it's released I will download it, and I will no longer be using this version of Blender, and there may be a slight delay before the next tutorial after that happens, while I refamiliarize myself with where everything is. That's what I'm not looking forward to, but I guess we had a certain amount of that when we went to the 2.7, or in fact might have been the 2.6 line for Blender. There was a few changes there. There are some things I'm not so keen on, but we'll see how that pans out. Oh, it's upside down. Have you seen my tutorial on getting to know nodes, Kim? I mean, it's getting on a bit now, and I do need to redo it, but the idea of that one was a sort of 101 on basically nodes, and sort of, because I was the same as you to begin with. I was a little bit uneasy about using nodes and always focused on using this area here, but it very quickly gets quite cumbersome trying to do things, trying to create particularly procedural textures over here. And once you understand the basics of nodes and how they work, it's just so much easier. Yes, Mark. If you have a look on my channel, Kim, if you haven't seen it, it's called Getting to Know Nodes. It's sort of a little bit of a pun, or play on words, I suppose, really. Well, yeah, I can't remember how much detail I've gone into on those, but things like layer weight and stuff like that, they're not... Once you can, for me anyway, once I can relate it to what it means in the real world, then it sort of makes sense. Hi, Word Watcher. I'm getting the impression that Game Engine is probably on its way out. I don't know whether it will disappear with 2.8, but I do think it's on the way out. I know that they're not putting any development into it. Yeah, well, obviously there's a lot of things that can be improved. And that's absolutely fine. I mean, once you've got the basics of something that works, what you can do is obviously just take other people's node setups. I think one of the problems is that as you become more familiar with Node, you create more complex node setups, and then when you try to teach that to people, it is a massive, or I try not to do that, but nevertheless it is a massive set of nodes that are doing all sorts of things and interrelating, and that can be quite intimidating, which is why I tend, even this is, you know, it's not that complicated. And what I do during tutorials is I talk people through to sort of show this is where we're starting from and this is what it looks like, and then I put this one in and this changes it a little bit, and so on and so forth. Very good, Marcelo. Hi, Jay. I think with something like that, Jay, the way I started, as I say, I was a little bit uneasy about nodes to begin with, was watching tutorials and then sort of, first of all, recreating the node setup that the tutorial's gone through, but then thinking, well, what do each of these nodes do? So just taking the parameter in there and say, well, what happens if I take it down to 0? What happens if I take it up to maximum? And then the values in between, and seeing if I could see what was changing, and then regardless of what the real technical explanation for what was happening was, I would get my own view on what that meant to me. I use Filmic. I tried to make myself do that, so I've got mine defaulted to, it's probably going to be something else now. Yeah, there we go. I've got Filmic on there. Only really because I've watched a number of information videos, really more than tutorials, about Filmic. They say it gives you more the ability to display more information across a wider range. Of course, the same 0255 brightness levels are there regardless of what kind of render, what kind of setup you use for rendering your colors and brightnesses, but it's to do with how your eye can perceive them. I work in an industry where light levels and things like that are of particular interest, and I know that the human eye is not a simple linear machine. It is quite complicated, and some areas it can see subtle changes, more subtle than most electronic devices could perceive, and in other areas it's not very sensitive at all. So really bright things and really dark things it's not very good with, but things somewhere in between, or seeing bright things and dark things at the same time, the human eye is very good at. So I understand the concept behind what they're trying to do with Filmic, and therefore try to use it. I don't often play with the settings here like exposure and gamma, but occasionally I do. I always used to use RGB, and for me it's fine, partly because I post-process anyway if it's a video particularly, so once it's all produced, whether I do it in forgotten the name now, it's getting late here, here in a compositing editor, that was the word I was looking for. Whether I do it here, you can see I'm doing a little bit of color balancing here, or whether I do it in Adobe Premiere if it's an animation, or Photoshop if it's a still. I usually do tweak things a little bit afterwards, so whether it's produced in Filmic or not isn't so relevant, because the differences between, say, a brightness at 240 and a brightness at 245, while maybe not perceptible in sRGB, that can be stretched in other ways as well. I don't know if that made sense. gibbering here now. It's good. I very much encourage everybody to use the node system. It's just going to make things so much easier. And I know that there is available, but it isn't in there as default, which is why I haven't played with it, the animation nodes. And that is something I want to get into and have a play with, because animation is still a struggle. Not the basics of animation, but things like actions and stuff like that, compositing those together to give you some movements or expressions and things with a character that you can just call up, and then stitching animations together. I assume these are all the sorts of things that you can do with animation nodes. Yeah, mine's base contrast as well. I do find the others tend to be a bit extreme. Hi, Tube. Yeah, well, there's plenty of those, and particularly plenty of those in a live stream. Not to mention the umming and the ahhing, of course. No, as I say, I haven't played with animation nodes yet, but it's something I have my eye on, and it's another thing in the back of my mind to get familiar with, and then start to obviously produce some tutorials with it. What was I doing? How are we doing? Okay. Oh, that's what I was going to do. I was going to turn it upside down. Okay. So I'm just going to add a mapping node and add texture coordinates. Let's put UV there and vector there. It's all very oops, that's done it. All very dark in here. Well, it's sort of, I guess, Kim, it's just sort of having a good idea in your head as to, well, there's two ways of approaching it, I suppose. One is I want to make as realistic a texture as I can, so you take a photo, and that's never a bad thing to start from a photo reference, but then sort of break it down. I think in patterns, so if you have a look at any image, we look at the lower part of my image, so this is just an image of a forest at the bottom here. You can actually see this is, I'm not saying you could really make this image completely procedurally, but nevertheless there's elements of it that you could. So you can see there's lots of these little patches of green, which are obviously leaves of something, the leaves of the trees, I suppose. So you could give a feel of those with a noise texture, and then limit that noise texture with a color ramp so that you're only seeing the highest peaks of it, and then obviously give it a color and a bit of color variation, and that would start to give you the feel of those little patchy leaves. And it's understanding what the underlying pattern is that you're trying to reproduce, and then obviously layering them up and how you join them together. So obviously different things would apply in different scenes, Jay. One of the things I almost always use these days is world lighting. So certainly if it's an outside scene, use the sky texture. Even if it's not going to form part of the scene itself, it gives you a nice easy, even the defaults are a nice easy general light, and then obviously you can play with the levels of that light to make it brighter or dimmer. If on the other hand that's not appropriate, or it's an indoor scene, one of the things you can use is a large or an appropriately sized mesh. So just use a plane, make that an emissive plane. So you just under materials, you set it to an emission material, and that can then be as big or as small as you like. Okay, thanks, Marcellin. Not sure what you mean there, Jane. So where was I? Oh, I was going to turn my leaf upside down. There we go, sort of. Right, I'm going to turn my particles back on and let it render, so this may jitter a bit. Good night, Mark. And I'll be logging off shortly as well. And yes, of course, you're right, Jay. You can also use HDRIs to light the scene, and really that's considered to be the right way to do it. Although I do find that you're limited to the light, the strong points of light in the HDRI, unless you also add a sun in the scene and things like that. Hi, Arjav. So hopefully this isn't going to crash, but I'm going to start to turn my particles back on again. And here we go, let's let it render. Notice I saved. It may stutter a bit while it's trying to render. Oh, that's what you were saying, Jay. I've tracked back on what I was doing now. Yes, an HDRI is one approach, and certainly I use those occasionally, and will give you a more all-round light depending on the specific HDRI, of course. And you can make your own HDRIs, of course. I've got a video on that. Is this thing going to render? Ah yes, Blender's struggling a little bit now. So up to 1.2 gigs for the peak memory usage at the moment. I need to adjust the texture on the trees in the distance. Not quite how that happened. Good night, Martin. Typically, especially if you're creating a photorealistic render, it's probably a good idea to use an HDRI. It will give you a more natural light. That said, you can create a sufficiently complex light setup without an HDRI to give you a convincing scene. And obviously, the more complex your light, the more noise that you may have to deal with in the scene. The kittens are trying to get in again. I'm going to have to sign off soon. Good night, Trabuco. So I guess I need to call a halt to it there. I've been on for an hour and a quarter now. So any last questions before I go? Or any last requests for tutorials? Always happy to hear suggestions. Oh, those kittens. I've been thinking of trying to film them in slow motion while they're fighting, because they're quite impressive when they're doing that. Archie's having a nice nap on the seat next to me with the kittens locked out. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. Yeah, I was thinking about doing another one on nodes, Jay. And yeah, perhaps metals is not a bad idea. I know that Blender Guru did a tutorial talking about dielectric and non-dielectric materials, but I'd probably keep it a bit less technical than that. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for coming along. It was good to have people here. We had 26, 27 people at the peak, and that was good. And I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.